Picture a riverbank in Idaho, quiet except for the sound of water moving over stone. Now imagine that a team of archaeologists digging their pulled charcoal out of the ground, sent it off for testing, and got back a date so old that it broke almost every rule their field had followed for 70 years. That is not a hypothetical. That is exactly what happened at a place called Cooper's Ferry, and by the time you finish this video, you will understand why so many textbooks are quietly being rewritten right now. For most of the 20th century, the story of the first Americans was simple, confident, and taught to children as settled fact. Around 13,000 years ago, hunters carrying a distinctive style of stone spear point crossed from Siberia into Alaska over a land bridge exposed by the Ice Age, slipped through a narrow corridor between two massive ice sheets, and spread across an empty continent within a few generations. These people are known to archaeologists as the Clovis culture, named after the New Mexico town where their tools were first identified in the 1930s. Their spear points are unmistakable, carved with a long groove on each face so the stone could be lashed tightly to a wooden shaft. For decades, it was assumed that no human being had set foot in the Americas before these Clovis hunters. That idea became known as the Clovis first model, and it was not just a theory. It was treated as the boundary of legitimate science. Researchers who claimed to have found older evidence were often dismissed outright, their sites picked apart, their careers sometimes damaged, long before anyone seriously entertained the possibility that they might be right. The problem is that the ground kept disagreeing with the textbooks. And nowhere has that disagreement been more dramatic than at Cooper's Ferry, a site perched on a terrace above the Salmon River in western Idaho. Archaeologists led by Lauren Davis of Oregon State University had been excavating there for years, slowly working down through layer after layer of ancient sediment. What they found at the very bottom of the site was not a stray artifact or a single lucky discovery. It was evidence of repeated human occupation, meaning people did not just pass through once. They came back, again and again, to camp, cook, and work stone on that same spot. When the deepest layer was radiocarbon dated, the results placed human activity there somewhere between roughly 15,300 and 16,500 years ago. That is not a small adjustment to the old timeline. That is thousands of years earlier than Clovis was ever supposed to have existed. To understand why that number is so disruptive, you have to think about the geography of the Ice Age itself. 16,000 years ago, two enormous ice sheets covered most of what is now Canada. The Laurentide sheet spread out from the east, and the Cordilleran sheet came down out of the western mountains, and where they met, they formed a continuous, unbroken wall of ice sealing off the interior of North America. The famous ice-free corridor, the pathway that Clovis first migrants were supposed to have walked through, had not opened yet. Most researchers agree it did not become passable until a couple of thousand years later. That means the people who lit fires and shaped stone on that Idaho terrace could not have walked south through the middle of the continent, because the middle of the continent was still buried under ice. If the dates from Cooper's Ferry are accurate, and multiple rounds of testing suggest they are, then the people who lived there must have arrived by some other route entirely. The stone tools recovered from those deep layers add another twist to the story. They are not fluted Clovis points. They belong to something archaeologists call the Western stem tradition, a different style of toolmaking with a narrowed base designed to be fitted into a shaft in a completely different way. And in the Pacific Northwest, this stem tradition consistently shows up in layers older than Clovis, not younger. If Clovis technology had truly spread outward from a single founding population across the entire continent, you would expect to find it sitting beneath everything else, the root from which later traditions grew. Instead, in this part of the country, an entirely different toolmaking tradition sits at the bottom. That pattern suggests the story of the first Americans was never one clean wave of migration. It looks more like multiple groups, carrying different traditions, arriving by different paths, possibly separated by thousands of years. Cooper's Ferry is remarkable, but it did not appear in isolation. It is the latest and one of the strongest pieces of a much larger pattern that has been building for decades, one site at a time, each one chipping away at the old Clovis First Wall. The first major crack came from South America, at a site in southern Chile called Monteverde. Unlike most ancient sites, which preserve only stone and bone, Monteverde had been sealed under a layer of peat that kept oxygen out and stopped decay almost entirely. Archaeologists working their recovered wooden tent stakes still standing upright, cords of knotted plant fiber, chewed fragments of a medicinal plant, and even what appears to be a child's footprint beside an ancient hearth. Radiocarbon dating placed the main occupation at roughly 14,500 years ago, more than 1,000 years before Clovis. For years, skeptics challenged the site relentlessly, questioning the layers, the dating methods, and the interpretation of the wood itself. In 1997, a group of senior archaeologists, several of whom had publicly doubted the site, traveled to Chile to examine it in person. After walking the ground and studying the evidence directly, they changed their minds and endorsed the dates. It was one of the clearest examples in modern archaeology of scientists actually updating a long-held position when confronted with strong evidence, and it opened the door for other researchers to speak up about their own unusual findings. After Monteverde, other pre-Clovis sites began surfacing across North America, each dated independently, each using different methods, and each landing in roughly the same window of time. In Florida, divers working in a river sinkhole recovered stone tools alongside the butchered remains of a mastodon, sealed in an undisturbed layer, and dated to around 14,500 years ago. In Oregon, researchers excavating dry rock shelters known as the Paisley Caves found preserved human waste containing ancient human DNA, dated to roughly 14,300 years ago, a discovery that sidestepped arguments about whether stone had really been shaped by human hands, because there's no ambiguity about where DNA like that comes from. In central Texas, at a site called the Galt Site, excavators dug beneath the expected Clovis layer and kept finding tools in even older sediment, with some estimates pushing back 16,000 to 20,000 years. Individually, each of these discoveries could have been dismissed as an anomaly. Together, spread across thousands of miles and confirmed through completely different dating techniques, they formed a pattern that became much harder to explain away. Perhaps the most striking evidence of all did not come from tools or DNA, but from footprints. At White Sands in New Mexico, researchers uncovered layer after layer of ancient human footprints pressed into what was once the muddy edge of a shallow lake. Some were made by adults, and some were unmistakably the small prints of children, with spacing that suggested a child running across the wet ground. There is no ambiguity in a footprint. It cannot be mistaken for a natural rock formation or a strange coincidence of erosion. A team led by researchers specializing in ancient trackways dated the prints using seeds from an aquatic plant found in the layers directly above and below them, producing an age of roughly 21 to 23,000 years. That number placed human presence in North America during the coldest, most extreme point of the last ice age, long before the corridor south even existed as a concept. Critics raised a fair objection, pointing out that the aquatic plants used for dating can sometimes absorb older carbon from the water they grow in, which could distort the results. So the research team returned and tested the same layers using two completely independent methods that had nothing to do with those seeds: ancient pollen from land plants, and a technique called luminescence dating, which measures how long buried mineral grains have been shielded from sunlight. All three methods converged on the same window of time. The footprints held up. Taken together, these sites tell a very different story than the one taught for most of the last century. Clovis First is no longer the accepted model in archaeology. It has not been replaced by wild speculation, but by a more complicated and more interesting picture, one where people appear to have reached the Americas in multiple ways and at multiple times, possibly including a coastal route rather than a purely inland one. Some researchers have proposed what is sometimes called the Kelp Highway hypothesis, The idea that early groups may have moved down the Pacific coastline by boat, following rich marine environments along the shore long before any inland corridor opened up. It is worth being honest about where the science actually stands. Some of these sites, like Monteverde, are now broadly accepted across the field. Others are still being debated, refined, and tested, which is exactly how good science is supposed to work. The disagreement itself is not evidence of chaos or conspiracy. It is evidence of a discipline doing the slow, careful work of updating itself as new data arrives. There is one more thread to this story that deserves real attention, because it goes beyond stone tools and radiocarbon labs. The land around Cooper's Ferry, along the lower Salmon River, lies within the traditional homeland of the Nez Perce people, known in their own language as the Namipu. For generations, Nez Perce oral tradition held that their ancestors had lived in that region since time immemorial, far earlier than outside researchers were willing to credit. For a long time, that kind of testimony was treated by much of the scientific establishment as folklore rather than historical evidence, respected in a general sense, but kept separate from the supposedly harder proof of radiocarbon dates and stratigraphy. The findings at Cooper's Ferry did not just extend the archaeological timeline. They aligned with what the Nez Perce had been saying all along. It is a meaningful reminder that oral history, passed carefully across many generations, can carry real information about the deep past, even when it takes outside science a very long time to catch up. So where does this leave our understanding of how people first arrived in the Americas? It leaves it open, and genuinely exciting, in a way it has not been for decades. The old picture of a single group crossing a land bridge and fanning out across an empty continent in one dramatic wave has given way to something messier and more human, multiple groups, multiple routes, and a much longer, deeper history than anyone assumed when Clovis points were first pulled out of the New Mexico dust in the 1930s. Every few years, it seems, a new site pushes the timeline back further than researchers expected, and each time, the evidence has to be tested, challenged, and confirmed before it becomes accepted. That is not a flaw in archaeology. That is exactly how it should work. If you found this as fascinating as I did, I would genuinely love to hear your take. Which of these sites do you find the most convincing, and which ones do you think still need more evidence before we treat them as settled? Do you lean toward the idea of a coastal migration, or do you think there is an even earlier crossing waiting to be found? Drop your thoughts in the comments, because this is one of those rare scientific stories that is still actively being written, one excavation at a time. And if you want to be here the next time an impossible date comes out of the ground, make sure you are subscribed, because based on how things have gone over the last 30 years, it probably will not be long before another discovery forces us to rewrite this story all over again.